Hi, I'm Natalie, and I feel very honored to be here and to present to you. And I'm going to talk about the methodology, essentially about the methodology of maritime spatial planning in Russia. So I will talk specifically about marine functional zoning, which, as I will explain later, makes part of maritime spatial planning. I will discuss main goals and functions and the principles of the use of marine areas, types of usage, and categories of functional areas of marine functional zoning. So the mechanisms for identifying water areas and establishing restrictions were developed by the study conducted by Ermak Northwest. And these mechanisms were formed on the basis of the existing legislation in Russia, which is essentially planning. It's the regulations for territorial planning and spatial zoning. These mechanisms take into account the changes dictated by the uniqueness of the environmental planning, specifically of the marine area, and target sustainable development, which also includes, of course, the preservation of the unique ecosystems of Russian seas. And as I earlier mentioned, the marine functional zoning system is part of the Maritime Spatial Plan, and it defines the rules of the use of marine space. Ultimately, it is the method of rational organization of space. So before I continue, I think it's important to outline the main goals and principles of the maritime policy in Russia. It aims to ensure sustainable economic and social development of the country. It aims to preserve and save the natural ecosystems of the seas and rationally use their resources. It takes a holistic approach to maritime activities and its differentiation in certain areas, taking into account changes in their priority, which depend on the geopolitical situation. And of course, ecosystem-based management, on which my colleagues have spoken yesterday. So marine policy in Russia considers the marine environment as a whole, and it takes all the processes within the ecosystems as part of the same thing. So functional zoning approach on its own, it's a part of marine spatial planning. It establishes the boundaries and functional purpose of aquatic areas in accordance with the preferred type of use. This approach allows to minimize or completely avoid conflicts between economic sectors, as well as reduce the negative impact on the environment. So it essentially minimizes the conflicts between stakeholders. And a marine functional zone is a marine area with certain boundaries, with a homogeneous functional purpose and corresponding modes of use. The functional purpose is understood as the predominant type of activity for which the space is intended. The goals of marine functional zoning are to protect marine ecosystems, as marine functional zoning should consider the marine environment and the natural landscape. So, for example, all the areas that are designated as nature protection sites should be strict and must strictly protect the environment. The next goal of the marine functional zoning is development of economic activities. So the development of the marine economy should not be achieved at the expense of the marine environment, which in other words is known to be blue growth. And it is essential to promote the harmonious development of marine resources and the development of the marine environment. And of course, the resolution of conflicts among industrial users, maritime and non-maritime users, and protection of the common borders of land and sea, which is essentially the coastline, because the coastline is a valuable marine resource on its own, and it must be strictly protected. The protection of the coastline also is an important part of the marine policy and the direction of the development of it. And of course, ensuring the security of national defense and taking into consideration the requirements of the military sector. And functions of marine functional zoning are environmental protection, economic use, and reserve territories. So the principles for the use of marine areas are integrity of the ecosystem, rational use, and minimization of conflicts. So by maintaining the integrity of the ecosystem, we imply ensuring the safety of water areas, which are crucial for the preservation of biodiversity, ensuring the functional interconnection of zones, and perceiving the marine space as a single holistic ecosystem. By rational use, we mean providing sufficient space for existing economic activities while allocating space for new ones and future and potential ones. Promoting collaboration between different users where possible, and encouraging coexistence of complementary or interdependent users of the sea. Maximum saving of the sea space allotted to certain activities. That means that we aim to maintain the status of public water areas in as much space as possible to reserve it for future economic activities. So minimization of conflicts comes down to possibly combining use of space by types of economic activities with similar requirements for environmental conditions and infrastructure, determining priority type of use. Sometimes, if there are several compatible users of the sea, priority is given to the already existing, the one that is fixed with the zone. Promoting collaboration between different economic activities. One example that I've recently been reading a lot about could be the restoration of oyster beds among offshore wind farming, but that's not in the Gulf of Finland. That's just an example of a collaboration between different economic activities. And encouraging the coexistence of complementary or interdependent users of the sea. So activities that we considered in the development of Marine Spatial Plan, they are environmental protection, first and foremost, sites of underwater cultural heritage, aquaculture, fisheries, renewable energy, including wind, wave, and tidal energy, tourism and recreation, and scientific research, as well as marine transport routes and traffic flows, submarine cables and pipeline routes, marine subsoil use, which refers to oil and gas industry, military training areas, and dumping of soil. This is not an updated presentation for some reason, but landfills landfills is the wrong word here. We meant to say dumping of soil, as we were talking specifically about the storage of soil dug out in other economic activities. And other activities in the sea, such as artificial structures, islands, bridges, or anything else that did not get included in the previous categories. So the main function is the priority economic activity in the allocated area, and that's the most important term. And then there are three types of uses: permitted uses, conditional permitted uses, and prohibited use. They all refer to the gradation of strictness applied, restriction applied to certain zones. Permitted uses are the default activities that do not require any approval. Conditional permitted uses are activities that require approval, and if there's a conflict with another industry or another stakeholder which is identified as a permitted use, then the priority is given to the latter. And prohibited use, these refer to the activities that should not that should not be performed in the allocated area. So categories of functional areas. There are nature protection sites or nature protection areas, areas with limited activities, and areas of active maritime use. So nature protection sites are effectively areas that are designated for the protection of the marine ecosystem, and they require minimization or preferably complete elimination of the impact of economic activities in the area, or sometimes the economic activity itself. So areas with limited activities are areas with a minimum anthropogenic load and restrictions on certain types of use, while areas of active maritime use are zones with moderate or significant anthropogenic pressure. The territories belonging to these zones suggest a location of zones with economic activity in them, and sometimes they have one lead function or can share several equally important functions. Yeah. So nature protection areas, they are then subdivided into different types: protected zones, landscape protection zones, and underwater cultural heritage. Protected zones are patches of land and water that aim to protect. They have special environmental, scientific, cultural, aesthetic, and recreational value, or they have been withdrawn by the authorities fully or partially from economic use and have been granted special protection status. Landscape protection zones are aquatic areas where economic activities are prohibited or restricted in order to preserve the natural landscape. And underwater cultural heritage zones are protection sites which aim to protect, well, not the nature, but the underwater cultural heritage site underneath it. Yeah, so this is the nature protection areas currently in Russia. Sorry, not in Russia, in the eastern part of Gulf of Finland, with St. Petersburg to the right. Then we have areas with limited activities, which include buffer zones, sanitary protection zones, and restricted zones. And you can see them on this map. And then areas of active maritime use are, as I explained before, they are areas that include heavy anthropogenic impact in them. So merged all together, this comes into a comprehensive plan until 2030. And yeah. So in the future, it is assumed that there will be improved coordination between maritime and land planning, that there will be a better distribution of responsibilities related to maritime spatial planning and zoning, as we don't have a public authority established yet for the maritime spatial planning process. And we hope for a better resolution of conflicts between industry users, as well as increased attention to environmental monitoring and involvement of a larger number of stakeholders and their more active participation in marine functional zoning. And yeah, that's all from me.